I am Bill Fox. I am a physician. I'm actually an internal medicine specialist and a primary care physician in Charlottesville. And I'm currently serving as the governor of the American College of Physicians Virginia chapter. And for those of you who don't know, the American College of Physicians, we're very proud of it because it's the largest medical specialty society in the United States. And I just mostly, my role here is to welcome you all here. And thank you very much for coming to this symposium, which is co-sponsored by our chapter and also the American Bar Association and the Virginia Academy of Pediatrics. And we're really happy to be joined by Dr. Sam Bartle, who is the president of that group, and he's here today. And also the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police. I wanted to kind of start off just by kind of framing part of the discussion with a statistic, but not a statistic that you might expect. 21,000. So 21,000 is the number of people who died in motor vehicle accidents in the year 1925, way back when there were a lot fewer cars on the road than there are today. The way the government keeps statistics, that represents about 18 deaths for every 100 million miles traveled. Today, that number is 2. 2 deaths for every 100 million miles. So we went from 18 to 2, and that's an extraordinary achievement, but how did we get there? And that was not really by chance. It was a sustained and broad-based effort led in large part by people like Dr. William Haddon, who was a public health physician, and he was also the first director of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So that effort involved, first and foremost, a lot of research. Why do motor vehicle accidents happen, and why do people die in motor vehicle accidents? And then a sustained effort at implementing all the safety measures that we've all come to know, like seatbelts and 3-point seatbelts and airbags and rear view cameras and child safety seats, and a concerted effort to combat DUI. So this is what we mean when we say a public health approach. That is the evaluation of all the upstream determinants of disease and death, and then acting on those factors to save lives. So about a year or two ago, my organization, the American College of Physicians, along with the ABA and the American Academy of Pediatrics, we and 6 other professional societies, which, by the way, represent the majority of physicians in the United States, we released a policy paper titled Firearm-Related Injury and Death in the United States, a call to action from 8 health professional organizations and the American Bar Association. Now, this paper was based on a significant review of the scientific research on gun violence, and it outlines all the public health measures that can be taken to mitigate firearm-related injury and death. So you're going to hear about some of these policies today. The recommendations, which we believe are perfectly consistent with the Second Amendment, have now been endorsed by about 52 national and local organizations. Let me leave you with just a few other statistics. So there are 32,000 firearm-related fatalities annually, 2/3 of which, about 19,000, are suicides. There are an additional 74,000 non-fatal gun injuries per year, and all of this every year adds to the cost of society of about $174 billion. So these are all numbers that I think we can all agree need to come down. We need to take the example of people like Dr. Haddon to try to improve these numbers. Now, doctors and lawyers, we don't always see eye to eye on a lot of things. But the fact that we're not only in the same room today, but we're fighting the same fight, that in and of itself should be cause to kind of stand up and take notice. So on that note, I'd like to turn the podium over to David Clark from the ABA.
We know that gun injury and deaths in the U.S. are far higher than anywhere else in the developed world, by far. There are over 30,000, actually 33,000 gun deaths each year in the United States, and that's about 90 each day, about as many as were killed in the last November massacre in Paris, you may remember. That's every day in the United States. This is far more than in the other top industrialized countries combined. More people have died from gun violence in the United States in the last 4 years than American soldiers died in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq combined. Just 4 years. More Americans have died from guns in the United States since 1968, going back to one of the original gun control acts, than U.S. soldiers have died in all the wars in this country's history combined, American soldiers. So more gun deaths. So what can we do about it? Now, we're going to leave a lot to the program, and I won't say anything about the particular people that we have speaking to the panels, and you do have a handout that has a short bio on each of the speakers. But we do have some questions, and let me run through a few, just that there are things that to think about and questions that some of which may be addressed today in the talks and discussion, and some that we need to address as a country. Are there things that can be done to reduce the risk of this gun violence here and elsewhere? We can't stop all the gun deaths, but if there are things we can do to stop many of them, 10%, 20%, 40%, 50%, that's up to 15,000 lives each year that could be saved. Public health research. What does the existing research into gun violence, its causes and effects, and possible cures tell us? Does such research point to factors, including laws, that influence the levels of gun violence in different states? What does the research show happens to levels of gun violence, including gun violence by criminals, when gun safety laws are passed? Does the research show that laws designed to keep guns out of the hands of high-risk people make a difference? Do they show that even criminals respond to gun safety laws? Do more guns really mean less gun violence? What does the verifiable research say? Is there any legitimate, real research, any evidence that shows having guns everywhere reduces violence? And if there is no such evidence, what should we do when we're faced with such more guns claims? Guns in the home, does keeping a gun in the home really protect you, really make you or your family safer? Would it make a difference to you if all the research and legitimate studies on that question reach the same conclusion? What about safe storage of guns in the home? What does that make a difference? Then the Second Amendment, which is where the ABA partly came in. You might be wondering how the ABA and the medical groups were having the papers together. We were in it for 3 paragraphs that had to say Second Amendment is what the courts say it is, including especially the Supreme Court, and these factors that these medical groups and we are advocating here have passed muster with the courts and the Second Amendment. Well, what do we do when the courts have said almost all measures to control gun violence are constitutional, yet a vocal group continues to say every restriction related to guns violates my Second Amendment rights? And then this is something I know the medical groups particularly have been concerned with in public health, is why is there not more research by agencies such as the Centers for Disease Control into the causes and possible remedies for gun violence? We know that certain groups oppose any funding for any research into gun deaths and violence, such as research by the CDC. What is the reason for resistance to research, to knowing more? Thank you. We welcome. I know we have people in attendance from all of the co-sponsors. We appreciate the law enforcement officers with us today in attendance, and we have people from each of the medical groups in the ABA. And I will turn it over now to Josh Horowitz.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fox and David Clark. I appreciate it. My name is Josh Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence and the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. And it's a pleasure to be here today to moderate these two great panels today. I think that I was asked to do this because not only am I an attorney who has been involved in litigation in the past, but also I'm an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I work on public health issues. So I guess my job is to bridge the public health and the law. And I'll just say really quickly that throughout our history, when we talk about automobile safety that we mentioned, Dr. Fox, lawyers, public health practitioners, physicians have always worked together. And if you want to solve a problem, you get these groups together and you work on the public health angle, you develop the data, you develop legal strategies, you develop strategies for legislation. But this is the group that solves problems. This is the group who works together and has solved and saved lives over the last 100 years. So it's great to be in this great community of people who can help us think through some of these issues. And our role is to produce some of the facts and some evidence behind this, and then to have a great discussion. So I'm going to say this a number of times. When you think of a question, write it down on your card. There's a card in front of you. Who's collecting the cards? Do you have someone who's going to collect them? Lori's going to collect them right here. Just raise your hand. She'll come in and pick them up, and then we'll definitely get your questions asked. So this is the first panel. It's on public health perspectives. You asked a lot of questions, David. Shannon's going to start by answering just some of them. She could spend a couple of days up here answering all of those, and we only have about 12 to 15 minutes. But to start, I'm going to bring up one of the nation's preeminent public health researchers who looks at the intersection of gun violence, domestic violence, and risk. It's Shannon Frateroli, who's an associate professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management, which I happen to be an adjunct member to as well, so I'm very proud to bring her up here. She studies how policies are implemented. She studies the risks around guns and domestic violence and intimate partner death, and how illegal gun transfers affect violence. So Shannon, come on up, and we're glad to have you.
So my role here on this panel, as I understand it today, is to provide you with a 30,000-foot overview of the problem of gun violence in the United States and offer some ideas for solutions. So really to provide a foundation for this wonderful panel to have a discussion with you all about gun violence in the United States and viable solutions for addressing the numbers that I think we can all agree are far too high. So I'm going to start with some numbers, some of which will be repeated already. But for those of you who are visual learners, this pie chart may be helpful. As of 2014, the latest year for which we have data, there were a number of gun deaths in this country, 33,000, and most of those, over 60%, were gun suicides, which often is a surprise to people. Those are in the blue part of the pie chart. Homicides, of course, are also a significant part of the picture, as represented by the red. And then the other types of deaths that are included there are unintentional gun deaths, those deaths that might occur when a child shoots another child, and then undetermined. So the nature of the relationship of the death was not known at that point in time. But I just want to emphasize that in spite of the media coverage that really focuses much on homicide and the role of guns in homicide, that the majority of our gun deaths in this country are gun suicides. We look quite different when you look at gun deaths relative to other countries that we might compare ourselves to. So for those of you in the back who didn't take up the invitation to take one of these empty seats in the front, the United States is at the top of this chart here, and you'll see that both gun suicides, as represented in blue, and gun homicides far outnumber the gun deaths in other countries, again, like us. The countries included are Western European countries, Scandinavian countries, and Australia is up there as well. And just as a point of clarification, what's represented here are rates of gun suicide and gun homicide, so it does take into account the smaller population in these other countries. But much higher rates that we see for both gun homicide and gun suicide relative to other countries in the world. So let's spend a little bit of time looking in depth at a couple of the sections of that pie chart that I started with. So first, gun homicide. May not be a surprise to anybody in this room that gun homicide does not affect everybody in our country equally. What I've listed here are rates, again, rates, not numbers, of gun death per population. On the vertical or horizontal axis, we have rates by race and gender. Men are represented in blue, women in red. And the second set of bars there are members of our African American community. So in short, what I want to emphasize here is that when we look at gun homicides, most of the gun homicides are committed with a particular type of gun, handguns, not long guns, but handguns. About 90% is the estimate that we have. Shockingly, when we look again in detail at some of these bar charts, gun homicide is the leading cause of death for African American men aged 15 to 24. And I'm going to repeat that, gun homicide. Not just homicide, but gun homicide is the leading cause of death for African American men between the ages of 15 and 24. And just as a reminder, guns are something that are designed, deliberately manufactured, deliberately sold in our country. It's not something that appears in nature, that spawns in our riverbeds. These are consumer products that are made that serve as the leading killer for a segment of our society. I'll also mention that although you notice that women are far less likely to die by gun homicide in this country than are men, when women do die, it oftentimes is at the hands of someone who claims to love her, and oftentimes by a gun. Let's also look at gun suicide. Again, that's the biggest part of that pie chart that we started with. The numbers look a little bit different here than the homicide numbers do. So when we think about gun homicide, the parts of our community that are most affected are white men, and specifically older white men. Our Alaska Native and American Indian populations also suffer from high rates of gun suicide. Again, the takeaways that I'd like to call from your attention are that when we look at suicide overall, it's the 6th and 7th leading cause of death for American Indians and Alaska Natives and white men respectively, and guns are most often used in these suicide numbers by both groups. Again, the numbers for women are much lower, and one of the reasons for the lower numbers is that women simply turn to guns less when they are attempting suicide. So women are less likely to use guns, and guns are a very effective mechanism to commit suicide. So the numbers look quite different between the genders as well. So let's talk a little bit about how we can intervene to affect some of these gun deaths. When we think about how guns come into our community, it's important to look upstream, as Dr. Fox encouraged us to do in his opening remarks. Guns are manufactured, they are sold at retail establishments, and are purchased from federally licensed firearms dealers by members of our community. With very few exceptions, the guns that are in our homes and communities on our streets begin with a legal first retail sale. However, there's a whole nother market, and there's a whole nother set of transactions that happen that are important points of intervention, possibly. So we have the private market, the non-FFL gun transfers that happen when two gun owners exchange a gun that isn't regulated in the same way that those first retail sale purchasers are. Best estimates we have are that about 40% of the gun transactions in this country are represented by those transactions between private individuals. And the federal government has no oversight of those transactions. So in most states in the nation, background checks are not required between two people who sell a gun between one another, and the federal government does not require background checks to take place. So there's an opportunity there for additional oversight. And why is that important? Well, when we think about ways to intervene, policy and other strategies to intervene with gun violence, there's a number of points that we think are important. One, and perhaps first and foremost, is that we look to intervene and prohibit gun access by people who are likely to be at higher risk for committing gun violence. We know from a lot of research that's been done that there are ways to identify those who are at higher risk of gun violence, and focusing on those at higher risk, and those people are those who have been violent in the past, is a good way to prevent future gun violence from happening. We want to assure that owners and sellers are accountable for the guns that they bring into their homes and communities, and we want to also encourage safer gun design. Importantly, too, as well, we want to assure that the laws that are passed that are based on these good principles are effectively implemented and enforced in order to maximize their potential. So when we think about who is at high risk for violence, it may not come as any surprise that what decades of research shows is that the people who have been violent in the past are most likely to be violent in the future. And really that's reflected in some of our federal laws that prohibit felons, for example, from purchasing and possessing guns. But there are other categories of violent people that we can extend these prohibitions for. And the evidence suggests that doing so is a good idea in terms of reducing the number of gun injuries and deaths that occur in our communities. So the first strategy that I'd like to put forward that's based on this idea is based on the idea that the evidence we have that shows that people who have been convicted of violent misdemeanors, so have gone through our courts, our criminal justice system, and have received a conviction for a violent misdemeanor, are at significantly higher risk for committing future violence. And what we see when we look at laws in states that have prohibited violent misdemeanors from purchasing and possessing guns, what we see is significant effects with regard to the reduction in their subsequent criminal activity. So by extending prohibitions to include violent misdemeanors, we can expect to see reductions in criminal activity involved with a gun. The other group that I'd like to focus on is domestic violence offenders. And domestic violence offenders are subject under federal law, those who are respondents to domestic violence restraining orders, to prohibitions on the purchase and possession of guns. Again, when we look at state laws that mirror federal law, we also see significant reductions in intimate partner homicide generally and intimate partner gun homicide in particular. So again, good evidence that focusing on those with a prior history of violence is a good strategy with regard to limiting access to guns. I'd also like to point out a new type of policy that has only recently been implemented in California, went into effect on January 1st of this year, called the Gun Violence Restraining Order. And the Gun Violence Restraining Order is based on the learnings that we've had from domestic violence restraining orders and the successes we see from that law. And what gun violence restraining orders do is open the civil courts to members of the community and say, if you are concerned about a loved one, a family member who is in crisis, you can petition the court and ask for the court's help in two ways. If the court determines that there is a significant risk for future violence, either to the individual themselves or to others, the court, under California law now, can temporarily prohibit future gun purchases by that respondent and authorize law enforcement to remove from the respondent's possession any guns that they already own. So from my perspective, this type of approach that allows family members to come into the courts and ask for the court's help when they see that a family member is in crisis has tremendous implications for suicide. Because oftentimes it's family members, it's the mothers, it's the brothers, it's the uncles that are on the front lines of seeing that something has gone terribly wrong. And they arguably are in the best position to recognize that crisis. And if we give them access to the civil system in a way that can remove firearms from that situation while that crisis is ongoing, I think there's tremendous implications. And the preliminary anecdotal reports we're getting from California are that they're being used effectively to do just that. The third strategy I'd like to mention, again, focuses on that, the oversight of purchases and access issues. Licensing of gun purchasers has long been a strategy that has been tried in several states. And in Missouri, a few years back, there was an opportunity to study an unfortunate policy decision when they decided to repeal a longstanding handgun licensing act. And what an evaluation of that repeal showed is that when we looked at the average time to crime for guns post-law, what we saw is that Missouri's time to crime went up significantly, while that time to crime indicator was going down nationally. Perhaps more importantly, when we looked at gun homicides in relation to this law, what we saw was a trend going in a troubling way as well. So Missouri is represented by the blue line, and these are gun homicide rates. And what we see is that after law, rates of gun homicide increased, whereas in the Midwest, surrounding states, those rates were on the decline as well as in the U.S. So trends going in the wrong direction. And the last strategy that I'd like to propose goes far upstream to that sort of manufacturing part of the graphic that I started with, which is the idea that we can do better with regard to gun violence prevention if we think more strategically and more deliberately about the design of guns. And you may be surprised to learn that this actually has quite a long history in U.S. gun design. So way back in the 1880s, D.B. Wesson, who was one of the founders of Smith & Wesson, read about a child who had been killed by one of his handguns. And he tasked one of his lead engineers to design a gun that couldn't be fired by a small child. And this is what the engineer came up with. It's a gun that in order to operate it, you have to both suppress this handle on the back and pull the trigger, which is something that a child's small hand cannot do simultaneously. So way back in 1886, our gun manufacturers came up with a great solution to reduce unintentional gun deaths among children. Fast forward to the modern era, in which we're probably all carrying tremendous technology with great potential in our pockets. There's been a number of gun manufacturers, gun designers who have entered this space and said there's no reason that we should be designing guns that can be fired by small children. And in fact, why are we designing guns that can be fired by people who aren't legally authorized users? What I have here on this slide is a picture of an Armatix gun. Armatix is a German manufacturer that has produced a gun that will only operate by an authorized user. It uses radio frequency technology that is worn on the wrist and turned on with a pin code, and the gun will only operate, that green light will only turn on if it recognizes that wrist device is on and working and letting the gun know that it's okay to work. So Armatix has been working mightily to try to get its guns available for sale in the United States. It has been blocked to date by politics, and that's the end of that story remains to be seen. But there is, from my perspective, again, tremendous potential in safer gun design, not only for those unintentional deaths among children, but for keeping guns in the hands of people who are authorized to use them, in the hands of people who are less risky for future violence. And this is a technology that I hope we'll be exploring more moving forward. A personalized gun that's stole from a home is inoperable by the person who steals it and attempts to use it on the street. So I'll just close by saying that when we do public polling around these issues, public opinion polling, what we see are surprisingly large numbers of support for many of these policies that I put forward. Universal background checks are listed here, licensing are listed here, some domestic violence provisions are listed here. And what the different columns say are not just the general public, not just sort of liberal-leaning voters, but the last two columns are polling numbers for gun owners and people who identify as NRA numbers. So again, high levels of support for some of these policies among all of these subgroups of our population. So perhaps contrary to popular belief, I think there's great potential in this country for improvements on the gun violence prevention front.
Thank you, Shannon, for that great overview. Some of the things I'm going to say will reinforce what's already been said, but it's coming from a Chief Diversity Officer. I'm Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Virginia. And a graduate of Eastern Virginia Medical School, just went there for a 40th reunion just the other day, and from there to Las Vegas for the American College of Emergency Physicians meeting to do a book signing on diversity and inclusion and quality of patient care. So some of the information you'll see has a diversity bent to it. So we're talking about targeting the gun violence epidemic. When we talk about epidemic, what do we mean? So we're talking about something that's prevalent or something that's widespread. And I'm going to show you a chart here in just a minute so you can see where gun violence lies compared to other healthcare related issues. And when we talk about a public health approach, what are we talking about? We mean the science of caring for people within a community. And a lot of it has to do with prevention and education. So I served as the vice chair of the Virginia Tech Review Panel, and Gerald Massengill, who was retired superintendent, was the chair. We held about 200 different interviews of family and friends, providers, and so forth. We had 4 public sessions at 4 of our universities, and our report went to Governor Kaine and contained 93 recommendations. Many of those recommendations regarded mental health and campus safety, but quite a few of those required legislation, further look by the legislators, and also a further look by the Commonwealth Commission on Mental Health Law Reform. And just to make a comment about mental health, 1 in 4 American adults have a mental health disorder, and about 1 in 3 American college students have some type of symptom related to anxiety, depression, or eating disorders. But not all people with mental illness are a danger to themselves or to someone else. I'll mention a couple of the Virginia Tech recommendations because obviously we don't have time for 93 of them. This is the first one. That one. So Virginia should require background checks for all firearm sales, including those at gun shows. And at the time, this was 2007. So you realize that the most important gun acts, 1968, then the next one, 1993, the Brady Act, the internet was growing by then, and the internet has grown quite a bit. So in 2007, we didn't put the word internet there, but as we were talking about gun shows, it incorporated internet as well. And as you all know, you just heard that the federal law currently does not require universal background checks. The federal law does require that licensed firearm dealers, but not unlicensed sellers, have to initiate a background check. And so NICS, or the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, is what is used by the federal government and can be used by the state as well. And here in our state, the state police, they do the background checks using a DSP, designated forms for state police. The most dangerous gap, and you heard Shannon mention that, is a private sale loophole, whereby 40% of the guns are actually sold. And these are done by unlicensed individuals for the most part. So the growth of the internet has significantly increased the ability of individuals prohibited from possessing firearms to find sellers who will sell them, transfer the firearms. As a matter of fact, about 96% of the firearms that are obtained from by people who have a criminal record are usually gotten from the black market, from the internet, but not from a licensed firearms dealer. And there are over 170,000 firearms listed on the internet on an internet list called Arms List. One other Virginia Tech, let's go back this way. One of the other recommendations we gave the governor, anyone found to be dangerous to themselves or others by court-ordered review should be entered in the Central Criminal Records Exchange database, regardless of whether they voluntarily agreed to treatment. And that voluntary or versus involuntary is very important. Governor Kane issued an executive order number 50 following the Virginia Tech tragedy to include reporting of involuntary outpatient treatment to the CCRE. And if you all recall, Sung-Wei Cho was committed involuntarily as an outpatient for selective mutism, and he basically was not reported to the CCRE. Had he been reported to CCRE, then the gun sales to him should have been blocked. One of the Commonwealth Commission on Mental Health recommended changes was to code number 37218, and it reads, a person may be involuntarily admitted to a psychiatric facility for treatment upon finding of the court that he or she has mental illness and substantial likelihood that in the near future he or she will cause physical harm to himself or another person. The language before that was imminent danger, and that wasn't very clear. So this substantial likelihood that in the near future harm would be caused is broader, takes into effect a broader number of mental situations. Now, this was for inpatient and outpatient voluntary commitment, but one of the recommendations we had, you saw a few minutes ago, we wanted to take into effect voluntary also. It does cover voluntary if the person was TDO'd. So again, adjudicated. Now, next slide. This is one I want you to focus on a little bit. This is the top 20 leading causes of death in the United States. And you can see at the top, no surprise, heart disease, malignant neoplasms, cancer, lower respiratory infections, unintentional injury, about 136,000. You drop down to suicide is number 10, about 42,000, and homicide, about 15,000. So on the numbers there, they don't look that big. But again, because it is affecting community widely, very important. And as a matter of fact, homicide comes just before perinatal period. You hear a lot about perinatal deaths. And so research is done in just about all those categories, including suicide and homicide, but not enough. Another figure, that 586 firearm accidents Shannon mentioned earlier, this was 2014 data, represents 0.4%, 0.4% of unintentional injuries. 0.4% unintentional injuries. So that's relatively small, but sadly, one child dies every other day in our country from unintentional shootings. And so when you add the numbers, here you see firearm deaths in 2014. If you go to the far right, there should be a column there for unintentional deaths. You would add those 586 to really come up with the true total number. About 33,599 total firearm deaths, and 2/3 of those are suicide and 1/3 homicide. So I've rounded the number off because each year it changes a little bit. Approximately 35,000 men, women, and children die each year from gun violence. Schools, workplaces, movies, theaters, houses of worship, and community. This is definitely a public health crisis. As I mentioned before, 2/3 death from suicide, 1/3 from homicide. And just quickly about African American versus white. So over a 15-year period from 1999 to 2014, of ages 10 to 29, there were nearly 60,000 black men who died from gunshots. Nearly 30,000 white men died from gunshots. Same age group, same period of time. So 2 to 1, blacks to white in terms of deaths from guns. Now, in that age group. However, in terms of homicide, justifiable homicide by law enforcement, from a Washington Post article, 469 white males were killed in 2015, and 248 black males were killed, justifiable homicide by law enforcement. So 2 times more whites fatally shot by police than blacks. But the total in terms of death by gun, black males around 7,000, rounded off, white males about 22,000. So 3 times more deaths in white males than blacks. And I think that may have been the last slide. So the bottom line, what I'm going to leave you with is AMA, which calls for policy legislation calling for a waiting period before purchasing any form of firearm, and supports requiring background checks for all handguns. So it is widespread in our communities, not as big a public health problem as a lot of the other diseases, but we need prevention and education, and the best prevention is to reduce availability to those who are prohibited from purchasing guns. And internet trafficking is a big one that we have to stop. Thank you.
My name is Stuart Hanakowitz. I'm a practicing internist in Burke, Virginia, Northern Virginia, and I am the chair of the Health and Public Policy Committee of the Virginia chapter of the American College of Physicians. My practice is a teaching site for the Georgetown Medical School and for the Physician Assistant Program at George Washington University and at James Madison University. And I first of all want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to sit here amongst such a distinguished panel. I'm a practicing physician, and I'm going to give you my point of view and my insights about what to do about gun violence from a clinician standpoint. I'm also would like to summarize the American College of Physicians recommendations that were put forth in 2014. And as the largest internal medicine organization, we have been very active in this area of trying to prevent gun violence. So I don't know if you all have the position statements and recommendations, but we can certainly get them to you. The American College of Physicians believes very strongly in a public health approach to preventing gun violence, and as such asks its physicians to advocate against for measures relating to gun violence, both in the legislature and in the clinic. Now, a couple of interesting things with regards to that. With regards to advocacy in the legislature, certainly in this state, from my experience, it's been very difficult to get legislators interested in listening to any gun legislation. And I will tell you that the physicians who are advocates and involved at the state and local level are also very reluctant to discuss this issue with state legislators. So if you have any ideas with regards to that, as regards to how to more effectively implement and advocate, I'm happy to listen. But for a number of years, Dr. Fox and I have not been able to put forth any gun control recommendations through our societies and to discuss them with the state legislature. Also, with regards to the clinic, we have been tasked by the American College of Physicians to speak to our patients about keeping guns unloaded and away from children, and to talk about gun safety. I've had a number of circumstances where patients refuse to answer these questions, and it's interesting. A lot of difficulties that patients have to do with the fact that they feel that, especially with the advent of the electronic health record, that this information will be put on a database, and that somehow it's going to be used against them and against their Second Amendment rights. So this is something that has had a chilling effect, I believe, on physicians asking these sorts of questions. I had the opportunity to ask my students whether they thought that they could ask about guns in their social history, because they always ask, if you've all been to the doctor's office, they ask you about alcohol and drugs and sexual history and so on. It turns out that patients are much more reluctant to talk about guns than they are about their sexual history. So there you have it, and that's the truth. And you have to, so we have to look at that. There's another issue. I have 1 minute left. Wow. Take 2 minutes. Thank you so much. There's legislation in Florida called the Docs versus Glocks legislation, where there's a gag ruling on physicians actually discussing guns with their patients. So that's the difficulties that physicians have. The American College of Physicians supports a number of pieces of legislation with regards to regulations of regarding purchase of legal firearms. They are also recommend regulations regarding rather using consumer product regulations with regards to guns. One last thing that I'll mention that I think is important in the American College of Physician recommendations is with regards to mental health. On the one hand, we feel that it's important to look at patients who are potentially suicidal or who have alcohol and drug problems with regards to gun safety. But we also feel that mental illness shouldn't be used against the large majority of patients who have mental illness who are not prone to gun violence. So these are some of the points that I wanted to introduce, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
It's a great honor to be a part of this panel. As you might have concluded, my degrees are not in law or in medicine. My degrees are in theology and in divinity, and I have a doctorate in leadership that actually emerged through my work with law enforcement. I am foremost a pastor in downtown Richmond at Second Presbyterian Church, as you may have heard. I'm also the law enforcement chaplain with a lot of experience through local departments and currently serving as the chaplain to the Richmond Division of the FBI. Unfortunately, it's my role with law enforcement that's connected me most deeply with this issue of gun violence, particularly the mass shooting at Virginia Tech, but also many other gun violence incidents that have gotten me in touch and personally related to police officers and citizens on a pretty regular basis. I've had the horrible duty of looking into the faces of distraught parents to tell them that their child was murdered in a college classroom. That's a duty no one would ever want. And, you know, we have no words for these people. We have the word orphan for folks who've lost their parent. We have the word widow for when we lose a loved one. We have no word for people who lose their children. And there's nothing worse than losing your child to violent trauma, especially gun violence. You know what? It's happening way too often in our culture. I've done funerals for people who've been killed in senseless gun violence. I've sat with police officers numerous times who've had to use deadly force because of so many guns in our culture. I'm currently coordinating a 3-day seminar for police officers. We do this twice a year now, the Virginia Law Enforcement Assistance Program, which I direct. We're meeting next week for 3 days in Massanutten Springs near Harrisonburg. It's for law enforcement who's been involved in critical incidents. Almost all of those critical incidents involve gun violence. In both the Christian and the Hebrew traditions in Scripture, all of our sacred texts tell us that life is sacred. Life is a gift from God, and life is sacred, and gun violence, we've seen the data today, is snatching too many lives. In both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, the most prominent command from God, spoken by God or spoken through angels, is a wonderful message. Do not fear, or be not afraid, or fear not. This is the most pronounced exhortation in the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. It's wonderful. Do not fear. And yet fear is a hot commodity in our culture. Fear is often not a good motivator. It leads us to things that become problematic. Fear is what makes people buy guns. Fear makes people want to get concealed weapons permits. More guns, more weapons lead to more gun violence. 13 million Americans have concealed weapon permits. That represents 12 times the number of police officers in the USA. So with the proliferation of guns and gun violence, this is a growing sense of fear. And it's a vicious cycle that I think brings a shame and harm to our common life. And as one who works a lot with police, I know firsthand that police are often outgunned on the streets, and that says something very negative about our society. And this has also led to the militarization of police, which has been a hot topic in recent controversies, but it's driven by the proliferation of guns and fear and violence, and we need to address the root of the problem, I think, is gun violence. Gun violence is not just a political issue. It's not just a public health issue. It's a spiritual issue. Too readily we have seemingly adopted the following. Individual rights are more important than community rights. Individual rights are crucial and important. I love individual rights, but not when community life is imploding, and we've seen the data already today. All the major religions call us to life together, lives not in fear, lives building community, lives not separated by one another. Jesus says it pretty well, love your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. And instead, we allow fear to prosper and guns to prosper. And it seems that the Second Amendment is more important than the Second Commandment. The Second Commandment tells us to not make idols, and guns seem to be our idols. So we got this proliferation of guns and easy access to guns, and we're on a road that goes far, I think, from what God calls us to be. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Unlike the previous presentations that you've heard already today, this one is going to be pretty laser focused on a singular issue within gun violence prevention. And that's because this is a topic that I don't think gets as much media attention as it deserves. And that is removal of firearms, particularly from persons subject to domestic violence restraining orders. And as most of you know, federal law prohibits purchase and possession by persons subject to domestic violence restraining orders issued after notice and a hearing for particular relationships, as well as persons who have been convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors. There are a number of states that have analogous laws, either mirroring the federal law or broadening it a bit, covering a larger number of protective orders or a larger scope of domestic relationships. But what happens once that prohibition is in place? These persons have been determined not to be able to purchase or possess weapons, but who is ensuring that they no longer have weapons that they had previously bought and owned? And in some states, the answer is nobody is checking. But fortunately, in a majority of states, and you can see from this infograph I have on the screen here, there are 29 states and the District of Columbia that have laws either requiring or authorizing judges to order respondents to domestic violence protective orders to dispossess themselves of firearms. And there are three distinct ways that I describe this being done. The first is surrender. Respondents are given a time period in which to voluntarily hand over firearms, either to law enforcement, a federally licensed firearms dealer, or a third party. There are also instances in which a court judge with the appropriate probable cause can issue a search warrant where law enforcement can go and search for and seize firearms from that respondent. And then something that I call a hybrid approach. And California, I think, is the best example of this. Respondents are given, so if an order is served by a law enforcement officer, that officer will request immediate surrender at that moment in time. If that doesn't happen, respondents are given 24 hours to surrender firearms to law enforcement or to a licensed dealer or to sell that firearm. If that doesn't happen within the 24-hour period, courts can issue a search warrant, sort of a sweet and then sour approach to firearm removal. And there are, as you can imagine, a number of difficulties with this process. And I'm sure the law enforcement in the room will be very sensitive to these. First, identifying respondents who are in possession. How do we determine if a respondent has a firearm? And often the only piece of evidence we have for that is from the petitioner themselves, either in the petition or from conversations with domestic violence advocates or law enforcement officers. And then service. How can a respondent surrender firearms if they haven't received notice of the order? There are storage concerns for law enforcement. If law enforcement is the only person who is able to take possession of those surrendered firearms, where do they store all these weapons? How long must they store it for? If a respondent is permanently prohibited under state or federal law and can't have that firearm returned, what can they do with it? Do they store it forever? Is that respondent offered an opportunity to sell the firearm? Can law enforcement destroy it if it can't be returned? And then, of course, if a respondent is able to retake possession when an order expires or is terminated and there's no other prohibition, how do we return the firearm? Do we run background checks on that person to ensure that they are not prohibited? What is the process for that and the protocols? And as Shannon alluded to in her presentation, implementation is critical at all steps of this process. You could have a perfect statute, but if stakeholders don't know what their role is in that process and how to implement that, that's not going to be effective either. So we at the Educational Fund, in conjunction with the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, which is a group of the nation's leading public health and mental health experts, as well as attorneys and advocates, and the Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, teamed up last year and published a report on removal of firearms from persons subject to domestic violence protective orders, which goes through each step in this process and offers recommendations at each step there. So I would encourage you, if you'd like more information on this topic, to visit our website at efsgv.org, and I can see if we can get the report emailed out to all the participants for a greater amounts of information on each of these topics that I've discussed today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. And now we're going to turn to questions for the entire panel. I want to start with a question about mental health. We talked about that in some cases mental illness can be a risk factor, but we don't want to further stigmatization. Are there policies, maybe we'll start with Shannon on this and move to some of the physicians. Are there policies that more tailored to this, tailored to this, appropriate to balance the dangerousness versus stigmatization?
So thanks, Josh. I'm happy to kick this off. So I think there are policies. Our group, which Kelly alluded to, the Consortium for Risk-Based Firearm Policy, has done an exhaustive review of the literature and really has concluded that focusing exclusively on mental illness isn't going to get you much in terms of returns in gun violence prevention. Gun violence or mental health on its own is responsible for about 4% of the interpersonal violence that we see in this country. So it's just not an effective way to think about solving interpersonal gun violence. It absolutely has to be considered when we think about suicide because it is a major risk factor for self-harm, but we need to be very careful when we think about policies related to people with mental illness in regards to preventing interpersonal harm. I think from my perspective, the gun violence restraining order, which I alluded to, is a good strategy for calling attention to people who are in crisis and may or may not have a mental illness, but are certainly acting in ways in which the people around them, their family members, are concerned. They're alluding to dangerous behaviors, perhaps they've started acting violently, and being able to provide family members with a tool to intervene before those behaviors turn to violence, from my perspective, is a really good way to start to address risky behaviors. And what we're seeing in some preliminary data around a law that is similar to the gun violence restraining order is that actions such as this are a good way to get people who need treatment into the mental health system. So I would say that one of the most promising policies really is gun violence restraining order policies that allow family members to proactively address the risks of guns while in crisis.
Great, thank you. Any, Dr. Martin? Dr.
Yeah, I'm going to mention, and I'll pass it on. When I gave the talk, I mentioned 1 in 4 adult Americans have some form of mental illness, and 1 in 3 college students have some form of anxiety, depression, or eating disorder. So in and of themselves, it does not constitute someone who's dangerous. And as I mentioned to you in terms of the code related to a commitment or adjudication for a commitment, substantial likelihood to cause harm to self or other, would be the type of patient that we would commit. And the Gun Control Act of 1968 had 10 basic elements to it that would be where you identify categories where someone should not be sold a gun: convicted felon, individual convicted of a crime punishable by 1 year or more, fugitive from justice, individual adjudicated mentally ill or committed to mental institution. And we went through that with Virginia Tech tragedy, sorting out the involuntary commitment. Controlled substance abuser, so someone coming to me as a physician, if I'm having a conversation with them about guns, certainly I would not advocate them going to try to get a gun. An alien, someone who's renounced citizenship, someone who's committed a domestic violence, misdemeanors we heard a few minutes ago, dishonorable discharge from the military, and someone who's stalking. In the case of Sung Wei Cho, he was a stalker. That was another reason why he should not have gotten a gun. People know that.
Yes. So the American College of Physicians includes in their recommendations, as I mentioned, the issue with regards to mental illness. It's very important to physicians and to not stigmatize mental illness, which is so prevalent in our society. However, you can and should tailor your approach to the patient. If the patient is suicidal, if the patient has a history of violence, if the patient has a substance abuse problem, that is a red flag for the physician. And similarly, and this is mentioned in the ACP policy recommendations as well, if someone in your home is either a child or someone who has substance abuse or someone who's demented, they should not have ready access to guns as well. So it refers not only to the person who has the gun who may commit a violent act, but also access of that gun to others who might use it to harm themselves, where they're not mentally aware, whether they're children or they're demented elderly or people who are have substance abuse problems.
Thank you. Let me follow up with another question actually about the ACP recommendations, and this is to either of you. So there was a question about why the recommendations are just focused on handguns, or is it for all guns? Or
actually, not. There is a part here in the recommendations that talks about. And by the way, I've learned something very important, is that when you reach a certain age, you should definitely have larger print. This is something that I'm learning today. So anyway, a part of the recommendations are to ban the sale and manufacture for civilian use of firearms that have features designed to increase their rapid killing capacity, often called assault weapons or semi-automatic weapons. So that's one of the recommendations that the ACP has.
And you would say extend universal background checks to all handguns, long guns.
That is correct. That was also in the ACP recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was President Obama's Fix the Gun Checks Act that included language about banning semi-automatic weapons and magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. That went back to that law we had before the sunset, when it was more than 10 rounds, 15 rounds was banned. But I think that coupled with the universal background checks for all weapons is important.
Okay, great. So the next question actually is asking, following up on the question that what your statement earlier about how difficult it is to get people to introduce legislation for the ACP. And I saw one of our great champions, Alfonso Lopez, walk in the room. Did I see that, or was that my imagination? All right. So Alfonso Lopez is a great legislator supporter. If you guys want to introduce legislation, you will talk to each other. I saw them in the room. I know. But I think the question is basically, who can introduce legislation? The question we have is, can you find champions? I hope the answer is yes, but maybe, you want to.
I think there's a lot of reticence on the part of healthcare organizations to introduce such legislation, and that is just a fact. I mean, because the fear that it will antagonize legislators, that it will not pass, and that they'll lose whatever leverage they might have on other issues. So it's been the kind of unspoken policy of these organizations to just, along with abortion, for example, to leave those issues alone. And again, I'm just speaking as a Virginia person, but I know that this is a problem nationwide as well. So it's destined to fail. Why should we go and advocate for this? And because we'll lose whatever support we might get on other issues.
I would just sort of.
I'm not stating that that's my point of view. I'm just analyzing.
I'll take just the moderator's privilege here and just say, there's been a lot of bills introduced in the last couple of years. There's a lot of willing legislators, and you're starting to see support sometimes even from both sides of the aisle. So I think if you frame them properly, if you work with some of the legislators, I think that you will find some willing folks in the Virginia legislature. I know that this issue. I remember when I first started coming here, even my delegate from Northern Virginia would hide under the desk and not answer the door. That's completely changed, and now there's a lot of willing delegates. So I don't know if last time you revisited this, but I would just encourage you to talk to some of the legislators. We'd be happy to introduce you to someone I think would do some really great stuff.
We have, and we will continue to do so. But thank you. But I just wanted to raise the issue because we need to figure out a policy, a way of implementing these things.
And certainly the way it's addressed, because in terms of background checks now, it's not universal, as we said, and those with the federal firearm licenses, who basically sell guns, licensed to sell guns, 60% of guns are sold that way, 40% are sold the other way, from person to person, gun shows, or the internet. So it's basically, how do you get to that point to say that when guns are sold through the internet, the person has to be licensed also. The person who's buying the gun has to have a permit. And that would cut out a huge number of the violent crimes and the deaths, even deaths of kids, even deaths of young black males 10 to 29. Because where are they getting the guns? They're not going to the federal licensed firearm dealer and buying those guns. They're getting those guns off the street, the internet, and other places.
Okay. Anybody want to add on to that? Okay. So let me ask another question from the audience. Under Virginia law, you can buy a handgun at 18 without a background check from a private seller. During the 1980s, the drinking age was raised to 21. Is there some analogies here? And maybe the place to start is to sort of describe, there's a federal regulatory age limit and state limits and private sale versus public versus licensed sale. So I want to, maybe Kelly or Shannon take that on and talk about the age limits right now, and then I think what type of evidence about age is there right now?
Sure. Unfortunately, I can't remember off the top of my head what the federal.
It's 21 for licensed dealer.
Yeah.
18 for a long gun. 18 years old, you can buy a long gun.
Right. I think there's a pretty compelling argument to make that age limits for a number of things should be the same. I would turn to Shannon to talk about the evidence on why it should be a particular age.
Yeah, so I would say that generally one of the risk factors for violence that we know about is age, youth, and that oftentimes what we see in terms of violent behavior is people aging out. So if we can sort of push that age limit forward and limit access by people who are younger and sort of engaging in riskier behaviors that include violence, then I think that society would be better. It's been a long time since I've looked at the specific literature. There are a couple studies that evaluate sort of those differences in purchase age. So I'm not feeling very confident to cite those specifically right now, but I'd be happy to seek those out and post them on the website that you've established or the mailing list for that. But generally, a lot of people do age out of that violent behavior. So older is better in terms of people access.
On risk also, is there a gender component?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Okay. Sorry, guys, right? That's
Sorry, yes. But we're not in any position, of course, to suggest that men should be prohibited because of their gender. There's just some risk factors that
we can't do much about.
We can't do much about, yes.
All right. Any other comments on that question?
There's less likelihood for southern states to have universal background checks, and it's a higher rate of children dying in the southern states per capita than in the other states. And you'll have Maryland and Delaware and states like that have more of a universal check, but the lower states, with the exception of North Carolina, do not. And it's boys that are typically 2, 3, 4-year-olds that are finding guns under beds and playing with them and killing themselves.
Okay. And there also may be some, I'd like the legal panel when we get there to comment on this, because there might be some constitutional implications of raising the age limit, probably not to 21, but beyond that, I would imagine there may very well be. Let me just, and I don't know if anybody on the panel knows this, but I'm going to ask the question anyway because the audience wanted to know. Is there any studies about, and do people today have an increased willingness to take lives? In other words, are we a more violent society than we were in the past?
The research that's done at UC Davis shows that the number of gun violence and gun violence deaths haven't really increased much at all over the last 10 years. What we really need to do is to decrease. There's no indication, to my knowledge, that we're going to become a more violent nation necessarily. It's all about how do we prohibit availability to those who are prohibited from having guns now. I think that's the biggest question. We're not doing a good enough job now. So from the prevention perspective and the public health perspective, 35,000 deaths a year from handguns, that number needs to go down. It's not necessarily going up, but it needs to go down.
Well, yeah, I totally agree that it definitely needs to go down. And I think if you think about violence in the United States is not a more violent country. It is it's a more lethal country, so violence becomes lethal. If you look at sort of the index crime rates, we're pretty middling, but we certainly have a very high homicide and very high gun death rate compared to other countries. So I don't know that we are more violent, but we have the tools to make that violence more lethal. I think that's pretty clear. Okay, Shannon, I thought I saw this on your data, but I could be wrong. Is there a breakdown for self-defense or justifiable homicides by law enforcement officers or defense of others? Is that in your data?
So it wasn't in my data.
It was in mine.
Dr.
Okay.
Martin, yeah.
Yeah, it's high. It's 460 some for white males and 260 some for black males.
So about, I think I'm doing my math right, but also about 650 justifiable homicides?
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We just have a few minutes left, so I want to ask a couple of more questions. I understand that there's some new data out of Connecticut that looks at the gun violence restraining order and the efficacy of that, and that it was pretty interesting and compelling data. Shannon, can I ask you to help explain that?
Sure. So a colleague of ours, Jeff Swanson out of Duke, has had an opportunity to look at Connecticut's law, which has been on the books for about 15 years now. It's not quite a gun violence restraining order, essentially allows law enforcement that same authority, so law enforcement to intervene and say, we're worried this person is at risk for committing violence, either to him or herself or others. We're going to engage the court and get permission to remove guns temporarily from the situation. So it's not a mechanism for family members to take this action, but it is a mechanism for law enforcement to do it. And what we're seeing from Jeff's data is that the majority of these cases involve people who are at risk of self-harm. And very encouraging from his data as well is that these people are finding the restraining order process to be a gateway to get the treatment they need. So it serves to really be a wake-up call that, okay, the court is sending this message that you're in crisis, something is wrong, we're going to temporarily intervene, and you're not allowed to legally purchase or possess guns. That, it seems, is serving to really alert the family and the individual that it's time to take this seriously, that it's not something that they can deal with sort of in-house, and people are getting treatment that they can need that can make a difference in the quality of life and the safety of their lives and those around them. So that's very encouraging preliminary data that's coming out of Connecticut, again, for a law that's very similar to the gun violence restraining order. But the main difference is that it's not open to the general public or to the family members to approach the court with this request. It is just limited to law enforcement.
So last question on the GVRO. Is this, are we seeing it being introduced other places? Will it be happening in other states?
Sure. So by my count, I think we've seen bills introduced in about a dozen states and interest from many more. In particular, if we look across the country and watch Washington State, they have a ballot initiative that's going to come up next month, in a few weeks, I guess. Their version of the GVRO, Gun Violence Restraining Order, is called the ERPO, the Extreme Risk Protection Order. It's based on the same principles. Polling data suggests right now that it's going to go. So again, California was the first state to adopt this kind of policy. It looks like Washington will be the second. And as I said, there's a number of other states that have certainly expressed interest and moved forward, but aren't as far along as certainly California or Washington at this point.
All right. For the physicians, there's some discussion about Florida has a rule that prevents physicians from talking about guns and asking questions about risk. Does that seem like a good idea, or is that something that you'd like to see pursued or gotten rid of?
It is certainly something that the American College of Physicians is very much against, and certainly restricting physicians' freedom of speech is not something that we advocate. This is the Florida law is still under litigation. It's the so-called Docs versus Glocks law legislation, and again, it has to do with certain groups feeling that if they're asked these questions about gun ownership, that they'll be put into some registry and some documentation, and that will somehow be used against them and to try to limit their gun rights. And so this, I believe, was passed in 2011 and is still under litigation. There is some provision that you can ask about guns in extreme circumstances. So if you feel that the patient is suicidal or there's imminent harm, you can ask that question. But you can't ask it as a routine question for in a questionnaire, for example, or just as part of a preventative exam.
Yeah, I was going to say, in an emergency setting, we ask the question all the time because of the types of patients that come in, and behooves us to make sure we ask the question. Pediatricians ask the question as well. American Academy of Pediatrics has a whole list of guidelines that they have put together to ask parents when children come in, do you have a gun in the home? They'll ask them about safety, where do you store a gun? They'll even ask the parent, when your child goes to another house to play, do you inquire if there's a gun at that house? Unfortunately, there have been too many cases where 2, 3, 4-year-olds will go to a bedroom of their parents or grandparents and find a gun under the bed that's loaded, and they kill themselves. So the pediatricians know how to ask these questions as well, and I don't think they get a lot of pushback on it.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Great. Great. So, Alec, I want to bring you in for the last question. We're about to finish up, but I think you talked very eloquently about the scriptures, about the work that you've done with both on gun violence prevention and working with law enforcement. I've been impressed how the clergy has recently gotten very involved with this. Is this a trend that we should be following? And do you see your colleagues, wanting to say this is something we really need to be involved with?
Absolutely. This is a huge problem, and we're even hesitant to talk about it as a society. It's too political. And I think a lot of people in our country think it's not my problem, or it's too big a problem and we can't address it. And that's shameful. I mean, we have to rally our troops. That's everybody. That's our congregations. That's our everywhere we can have public discourse and turn the tide on the 90% that's in favor of improvement on this against the politicians and the NRA and others who have such a grip on this. I think we have to call in all the forces and work together for sure.
Well, good. Thank you very much. I'm glad physicians and lawyers and public health practitioners and faith community are involved in this and trying to find some evidence-based solutions.